One of the more unique teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses is the idea that there are two distinct classes of Christians. They believe that there is one group of Christians, a small number, that will rule forever with Christ in heaven, while the vast majority of Christians and the rest of mankind who do receive life will live forever on earth. Now, to do a breakdown of this requires quite a bit of time because there are a number of verses involved that they will cite. So today, we're going to start with one of those texts. Now, before we get to the text in question, I want to look at their book, Benefit from Theocratic Ministry School Education. Because on page 84, it says, in order to read words correctly, you need to understand the context. And context is the key to the verse we're going to look at today. Because when we do look at it in context, we see it does not at all mean what they would say. The verse we're going to look at today is Luke chapter 12, verse 32. It reads, "Do not be afraid, little flock, because your Father has chosen to give you the kingdom." Well, how do Jehovah's Witnesses understand this verse? In the February 15th, 1995 Watchtower, they write, Jesus was speaking to his disciples, and he called them a little flock. He was also speaking to those to whom Jehovah would give the kingdom. Compared with the vast crowds that would accept Jesus in later times, this group were indeed few in number. So here, the article compares those of this little flock to the multitudes who would accept Jesus in later times. Is that the point of comparison, though? Let's also look at the September 15th, 1960 Watchtower. And it says, does this word mean you view your Kingdom Hall as the true church? No, the Kingdom Hall is not the church. Jehovah's Temple today is heavenly, spiritual. The English word church or congregation comes from the Greek word ekklesia, meaning assembly. Ecclesia or congregation is applied collectively to all Christians known as the anointed spirit-begotten class who are on earth at any particular time. Often it is applied to the local assembly in any place. Jesus called the members of his congregation a little flock. So the identification here is to Jesus' congregation or his church, and they say this church is the little flock. They compare it again in the 1995 Watchtower to the multitudes who would later become believers. But is this what is actually happening in Luke chapter 12? Well, the answer is no. And as we start at the beginning of Luke chapter 12, we see what transpires. In Luke chapter 12, verse 1, we read, under these circumstances, after so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were stepping on one another, he began saying to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So the events here begin in verse 1 with a group of thousands of people, a very large group gathering together. This group gathers together, but he first addresses his disciples. As he continues into verse 4, he is still addressing his disciples, and he says, now I say to you, my friends. Now we get to verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him. Jesus goes on, in fact, to give a parable for all to hear. But then we get to verse 22. And he said to his disciples. So what we find here is that Jesus has gone back and forth a little bit. He has addressed his disciples. Somebody from the crowd questions him. He addresses the crowd, and then he goes back to addressing his disciples. So in context, what does it mean when his disciples are called a little flock? Well, quite simply, Jesus is comparing their size as a group immediately with him, those who are truly his followers at this time, with the large multitude of people that are there present with him. This is not a comparison of the church with many people who would come to be believers later. It is not a comparison between two different groups of believers, one that's existed there in a very small form and would grow bigger, but still smaller than a larger group that would somehow come to exist. No, quite simply, and in context, they are a little flock compared to the multitude of thousands that are there present with them.